Hello and welcome, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to have you on board with us for the ESG Urgency webinar. My name is Ali Okani, and I drive the ESG division at Peak Asset Management. We're excited to have a distinguished panel of speakers with here today alongside our partners at Social Suite. A bit about Peak: we're a boutique investment management firm based out of Melbourne. We follow a co-investment models, which means that we have to back every deal that we do with our own capital. And ever since the launch of our ESG division 2 years back, we've seen tremendous amounts of investor interest in the space. And we've backed a number of businesses in the space, including circular economy businesses, green hydrogen businesses, battery metal companies, and the like. A bit about our panelists today. On the panel today, we've got Dr. Tim Sigenbeek from Social Suite. We've got Mr. John Wirth from Geo40 Limited, Mr. Boyd White, who's the chairman at Renew Energy Limited, Grant McCarthy, who's the managing partner at Tidal Ventures, and Mr. Martin Carolan, who is from Global Energy Ventures Limited. Mr. Alexander Keach could not be here from ECS Limited, but sends his regards today. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Tim. Tim, could you maybe give us a bit of background on Social Suite and what you're doing in the space?
Wonderful, thank you. Social Suite is a global leader in impact technology. We were founded in 2014 in Melbourne, and today we have offices in Australia, America, and Canada. And our purpose really is to help organizations show the change they're making. And to do that, we've developed technology solutions to measure, to manage social impact and ESG reporting. And we have a number of progressive and influential customers around the globe that use our technology to simplify the complexity that you often see around driving social impact and measuring ESG and ESG metrics and indicators.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Tim. Over to you, John. Would you mind giving us a bit of background on Geo40, what you're doing in the space, and how the company is approaching ESG?
Look, certainly, I guess we have a dual mission. We recover minerals out of geothermal fluids in a sustainable way. And in doing so, we create a level of innovation in what we call the geothermal ecosystem. And I guess at its simplest, we're replicating what was once called the eighth wonder of the world, the phenomenon of the pink and white terraces in the central North Island of New Zealand, where silica deposits on terraces as it cascades down a hillside. And we've been able to build a process that pulls silica out of geothermal fluid, and we sell that all over the world as a sustainable nanoparticle. And in doing that, we've scaled up from the lab through pilot plants, demonstration plants, and in February this year we commissioned our first large-scale plant, which is genuinely the very first plant on the planet that pulls silica out of geothermal fluid. Look, we're chasing very hard other minerals in geothermal fluids, including lithium, cesium, antimony, a range of minerals. And our logic is to do this in a very, very low carbon, sustainable way, as I guess a counterpoint to the way that these minerals are usually sourced. So we're on a very, very exciting journey, very research heavy, but at heart, I guess we are good at process scale up, right? Taking an idea and building a big plant around it. I think one of the most interesting challenges for us is that there is no low carbon sustainable source of lithium for the EV battery transition, right? And that's the company that we hope to be, alongside the work we do in other minerals. And of course, being able to validate that we do indeed have an entirely sustainable process that is low carbon, of course, is hugely important to our customers. It's important to our stakeholders and also to our people, to our own people. We do this because we believe in it. And this isn't. There's no greenwashing here. We're genuinely doing something we think is important. So we found Social Suite as a platform that looks right-sized for a business like ours. We're relatively small. We're 30 staff, $25 million worth of operational assets. So we're not quite GRI ready in that sense, but we are extremely committed to the sustainability journey and to continuing, I guess, the exceptional work we've done in the 8 years the company's been around so far.
So a bit about ESG urgency, right? I mean, we're seeing we've just come out of COP26. Countries have put out climate targets and made promises again. But the question is, what is really happening within the ESG space? Ever since the United Nations came out with their Sustainable Development Goals, ESG investment has slowly crept into the mainstream sphere. So ever since the launch of circular economy, green hydrogen, battery metals, and the likes, and we are slowly starting to realize that private sector has an equal, if not more, responsibility to add towards our climate agenda. Grant, welcome to the webinar. Could you give us a bit of background on Tidal and what you're doing in the ESG space?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ali. So hi, everyone. My name's Grant McCarthy. I'm founder and managing partner of Tidal Ventures. We're an Australian venture capital firm. We invest from what we call the seed stage in early stage technology businesses. And full transparency, Social Suite is one of our portfolio companies. We invested in Social Suite back in our first fund around about 4 years ago. The purpose of our fund is really two things. One is to help and grow great Australian product-led technology businesses, not just within Australia, but into global markets, whether that be North America or Asia or Europe primarily. And the second thing is that those technology businesses that we invest in and help the founders grow have a real purpose and focus on how they're doing something that's for the benefit of not only their close customers, but stakeholders within the general population or economy for that matter. And I guess one of the things that we've tended to find working in the venture capital space, in the private markets of venture capital, is that most founders do not only come up with these, great and interesting, innovative ways to build technology, but they do generally also have a really clear purpose and mission around how those products or services are going to help a broader group of people. So from the perspective of what we've been doing within the ESG space primarily, it's probably around two things. One is as we look to invest in assets, we do have a quite a simple framework, the way we think about what the purpose and benefit from an ESG perspective might be for a company. To your point earlier, Ali, even around Peak, we have, for example, an investment in a circular economy fashion business that enables obviously consumers to, once they've purchased something, actually put that product back in effectively a virtual wardrobe, which they could then use to re-rent or resell that item of clothing, down to things like Social Suite, whose core purpose is actually to help companies better understand and measure the impact that they have within their stakeholder group. So we're finding, ESG as a framework, number one, but also more generally just the common purpose out of these startup businesses, which is a very topical area, obviously, all tend to like and try and have some, social or environmental impact benefit based on the technology they're developing. So it's been a really interesting process so far to try and help the founders understand and frame that better sometimes as part of their stories. But also see just how prevalent that is within their thinking as founders these days.
Thanks, Grant. That's a really good overview from that investor perspective there. Boyd, for you, the same question, like from your point of view, like what does Renew Energy do? But also, can you share with us your views on ESG urgency and possibly in relation to the energy space, and how do you see that?
Oh, thank you, Tim. Thank you, Peak Asset Management, for an invitation to participate in this webinar. I'm Boyd White. I'm the non-executive chairman of Renew Energy. So Renew's an ASX-listed company. We're pursuing a strategy of investing in renewable and clean energy companies. So we see ourselves as an incubator and accelerator of these companies. So we're looking at acquiring a portfolio of strategic stakes in businesses and nurturing these businesses through their life cycle. We aim to acquire anything between 5% to 100% interest in these businesses. And our investments are generally early in the business growth life cycle, and that's where we see value. What we bring to these businesses is our ability to access the capital markets, the ASX. We have a very strong board with a board and executive, so we can support some of these businesses. And we create value for our shareholders on the other side of the equation by way of asset revaluation, and as the businesses move through their life cycle, supporting them through to, say, an IPO and or trade sale. So that's an overview of Renew. With respect to your question on ESG and how we see that evolving in the energy business, it's a very broad question. It's climate change, and the energy industry's really been the one that's copped perhaps a lot of the focus, primarily because power stations, for example, have a very small area you can focus on them, you can collect, you can measure. So there's a lot of change coming. So ESG in general, it's a very large. It's the three words can cover a wide variety of general issues. So in energy, climate change is probably one of the biggest issues associated in that. We're seeing in terms of the space that we're in, it's providing opportunities for investment, opportunities to work to net zero, etc. All of those particular things that are coming up. So I'm not sure whether I answered your question on that, Tim. So.
It's excellent. Thanks for that overview, Boyd. And for everyone watching, we work with Renew here at Peak, and are currently working with the company as well. So it's really exciting to see the business execute on its strategy as a clean energy incubator. Over to you, Martin. I would love to hear a bit more about what's happening at Global Energy Ventures and how the company approaches ESG.
Yeah. Thanks, Ali. Well, the first thing that we did, we went back to first principles when we actually developed our hydrogen supply chain. So we've actually developed a shipping solution that can emit zero carbon. So we've got a partnership with Ballard Systems. We've got for fuel cell future use in our ships. We've got electric drive engines. So we actually future-proof the ship from design principles on day one. So the fuel cells, to be clear, won't be available in the efficiencies and the effectiveness that we need on day one. But we have planned for the ship to be zero carbon. So zero carbon gets used a lot in this industry. I think for investors, they need to look clearly through the message of a label and actually see how they are plan to produce and report against that. We've used Social Suite for the last couple of quarters. I think it's an excellent framework for investors to track and monitor. So as I mentioned before, the E is not too difficult to try and look through transparently, but social and governance, and I think the pandemic has given more focus of people looking at social, racial, and economic benefits around what companies are doing as well.
Yeah, it's excellent to hear, Martin. I think one point that sort of strikes out, and Tim would love to hear your thoughts on it from a Social Suite perspective, is obviously, as we've seen, with fast approaching climate targets and a changing investor landscape, there's quite a bit of focus around the E part of the ESG. So from a Social Suite perspective, Tim, would love to hear your thoughts on ESG urgency and what you're seeing out in the market.
I think that's a really good question. And what we really see is a number of things. A lot of people ask for that. What is the definition of ESG urgency? And of course, it's really hard to just give that one off. But I think when you think about the ESG awareness, everyone knows environment, social governance are really key topics there. But when you really start feeling that urgency, it's when one of the following things kind of rings true, that you're aware of the accelerating landscape, the changing stakeholder requirements. And, for instance, there's this real need to start building robust ESG credentials. Stakeholders are asking for your ESG reports. Stakeholders are saying, what is your carbon footprint? So you really see that ESG landscape become real in terms of what you're doing as a business. It's no longer something that other people in other geographies are doing, but your stakeholders are asking for material disclosures on ESG. One of the other things is when you really start feeling that urgency is that you want to do something and you're trying to figure out, what are my ESG priorities? What should my company address? Which ESG framework should I start reporting against? So basically you are making your way through the forest of ESG acronyms and you're looking at, Should I be reporting against GRI or CESP or CDP or TCFD and many more of these acronyms? So it's really hard, in particular for small to medium-sized companies that don't have dedicated ESG or sustainability teams to really work out what you should be doing, what's the starting point, and who's going to do the work there. So it's around that, really thinking around, we need an ESG strategy, we need to start building genuine ESG credentials, and how do we then start to identify what data do we track? What are some solutions that we could potentially use to measure, monitor, and improve our performance? How do we report back to stakeholders? And then finally, it's really about, working at that, management level of the business, but also really hopefully with the board as well, at exploring what the future holds for ESG and your company. So it's really thinking around, what does it mean in terms of regulation and compliance? What are the risks, but also really not forget about the opportunities. So there's a whole lot of things there. Like if any of these questions kind of ring true for you, you start feeling that ESG urgency effectively. And what we do is we, as Social Suite, really trying to develop technology solutions that help you figure out and answer a lot of these questions and enable you to, to start quickly, to start that ESG journey today rather than to, see all the hurdles and think we'll do it later in the piece. We need to be perfect. We need to work all these things out. We kind of help companies really work these things out quickly, get them started, and really start to demonstrate progress quarter over quarter.
That's excellent. Thanks for that overview, Tim. I think some really good points in there. One of the things that I personally find from when you're looking at small and mid cap companies, and I think our investment ethos at Peak is we have to co-invest in everything that we do. So if you see a deal from our end, we're backing it with our own capital. That being said, one of the fundamental things that we like to back when we look at a company is the management team and their ESG approach. And the companies that we have on board the panel today, of course, are working very actively in the space. So without further ado, I'd like to get into some questions that we've received from investors. The first one's for you, Martin, and GEV. Obviously, energy transition is a big thematic within the ESG space as we're heading into fields such as hydrogen, for example. So in your perspective, how do you see GEV approaching that space? And how do you think you're going to report on those sorts of ESG metrics going forward?
Yeah, thanks, Sally. Well, the first thing that we did, we went back to first principles when we actually developed our hydrogen supply chain. So we've actually developed a shipping solution that can emit zero carbon. So we've got a partnership with Ballard Systems. We've got for fuel cell future use in our ships. We've got electric drive engines. So we actually future-proof the ship from design principles on day one. So the fuel cells, to be clear, won't be available in the efficiencies and the effectiveness that we need on day one, but we have planned for the ship to be zero carbon. So zero carbon gets used a lot in this industry. I think for investors, they need to look clearly through the message of a label and actually see how they are plan to produce and report against that. We've used Social Suite for the last couple of quarters. I think it's an excellent framework for investors to track and monitor. So as I mentioned before, the E is not too difficult to try and look through transparently, but social and governance, and I think the pandemic has given more focus of people looking at social, racial, and economic benefits around what companies are doing as well.
Excellent. And yeah, we've been working, like you said, on your ESG journey there. But I think it's really interesting to look at, when we look at GEV, is that a lot of companies, when they think about ESG and that urgency, like they do focus a lot on the E, but there's another dichotomy there where there's that risk versus opportunity. And there's really a strong focus mostly on risk mitigation. But it really feels like when you look at the way you've structured your business, is that it's really actually focused on ESG opportunities. And it's really interesting to see that you're really kind of looking at that perspective there, ESG opportunities. How do you see that at large play out in the market? And, both globally and in Australia, that, companies starting to look at not just the risk posed by ESG, but the opportunities. Do you have any comments or thoughts on that?
Well, we're still learning from from the whole principles and thematic, Tim. But the opportunity as a small company, as we're growing over the next couple of years, is to set a platform and try to get things right to begin with, rather than have to re-engineer an existing organisation. So the urgency for us is to try and do things right from the commencement of our, further in our development, and then hopefully as we become an operator of a big business. So that's one way that we're thinking about it. But it's not straightforward, but you've got to sort of put the principles and get adoption from the board as well as is a key one. So there's one thing for the CEO to stand up and say we're an ESG company, but it needs to come from across the board and their buy-in as well.
So we got a couple of questions from investors, and really kind of focused around the work you're doing. So you're really focused with GO40 on the energy transition. So it plays a lot into that out in ESG, the environment. But GO40 has also been doing a lot of work on social impact already, diversity, inclusion, governance. So what was really the reason why you were doing all that work already, that you looked more into like a formalized and structured and standardized way of starting to report your ESG disclosures? What was that trigger, I guess, that made you feel that ESG urgency to basically start disclosing in a more structured way all the great work you were already doing?
Look, I think it comes back to the original ethos for the company. So the original founders of GO40 were miners, right, who went looking for a sustainable way to source minerals. The geothermal energy landscape in New Zealand is intertwined with Maori and Maori land. So I grew up in Taupō, the very strongly Maori town in the central North Island of New Zealand. All of our assets are on Maori-owned land, and we've worked very hard to employ staff from that local iwi or Maori group. So a lot of our normal ways of doing business were I guess rooted in this environment of being on Indigenous land. There's a concept that in Maoridom called kaitiakitanga, which means guardianship and care for the environment. So, we believe in it. We act it every day, and it's an expectation, of course, of being on that land. And the expression we like most when we have these discussions about recovering minerals having impacts on an aquifer, the concern of the Ngāti Tahu Tribal Lands Trust, whose land we are on, is, to use their words, they will be judged by their mokopuna, which is the word for grandchildren, right? They think about impacts across generations, not the impacts this year or next year or the year after. So it's been a great, I guess, cultural base from us to start from. And when we tell these stories to customers, they sort of say, "Wow, that's kind of unique. That's great." And as we make products that are highly sustainable, of course, we need to be able to validate to customers that they are as clean and as sustainable as we say they are. So, I think there's a process for us with Social Suite of bringing together a lot of good work that's been done, and a lot of the things that we know we can continue to do better.
That's excellent, John. And I think you touched upon a few interesting points there. So I think from a stakeholder engagement perspective, we're obviously seeing ESG become increasingly important. I think on the one hand, you've got traditional landowners and guardians who you're accountable to. But on the other side of it, you've also got, for example, your customers and off-takers that are increasingly becoming more and more aware of the importance of being able to track and trace where the product is coming from. So a bit on that note, how do you find ESG reporting, as relevant to that particular facet of your business, and how do you see that progressing going forward?
Look, I think the challenge for us is very much one of education. So both in lithium and in silica. Let's take the silica example. The normal way of making colloidal silica, which is, I guess, is a nanoparticle at its simplest, is by melting quartz sand in a blast furnace, usually a coal-fired blast furnace. So a very high, pretty high carbon product. So when we burst onto the market with our low carbon alternative, we had to go through a real process of education with our customers to explain what this mechanical process replicating silica cascading down a hillside, right? Exactly what that was about and why it gave them a really credible alternative. One of our customers uses silica in paint to reduce the amount of titanium dioxide in paint. They're incredibly environmentally principled as a company. And the option to use a really, really low carbon sustainable silica is really compelling. But we have to be able to, I guess, tell that story, and by the story we mean that narrative, what it is we're trying to do, and then, of course, we have to be able to give evidence to it, which is why we've, I guess, embraced the Social Suite platform.
I think that's a great point, John, there. And a lot of people think about ESG often around, I have to make disclosures, I have to start ESG reporting, and then I need to improve my, the excellence, the quality of my disclosures. But there's a crucial third element that you really kind of touch upon really strongly. That is that storytelling, that narrative around what you're doing, and really making sure that you frame all the things you do within a wider context, like what is that ESG journey or as a company on? And I think that's a key thing that we see Geo40 do, is really take that ESG reporting, the excellence around what you're doing, and trying to find a wider narrative and share that with stakeholders at large. And I think that's one of the core things there that you touch upon, which is really fascinating and very important these days.
Look, absolutely, and I think if we can tie together, I guess, a series of narratives. So there's a cultural narrative around the expectations of strong kaitiakitanga as a I guess, a more mythical sort of story, and then there's obviously a dry technical story about whether anything in the aquifer has changed. And then there's other stories around the motivation of our staff. We're a collection of really smart PhD chemists, etc., and the magic that we can weave. But it's when those different narratives can come together, alongside the certification and the rest of it, I think that we have something that's, I guess, both unique and powerful.
That it really links really nicely to one of the other questions we had, and that's really about that, I guess, that ESG awareness to ESG urgency journey. And the question is really around, how do you work with founders at that, those early days in which, like you said, they're extremely busy. They got a million things to think and worry about. Like, how do you ensure that ESG is front and center? And how do you work with them to ensure that they have that sense of urgency? And how do you then get them from being aware to being urgent to actually taking action on doing something
Sure.
there? Is that something that you, before you engage with them, you make sure that's already, part and parcel of their mindset before you invest in them? Or is that something that you actively take them on that journey?
Yeah, so look, I think from at the front end of the investment, when we're actually carrying out due diligence and trying to think about how this business is going to grow and hopefully a very large successful business, there's a couple of baselines, right? Like, whatever we invest in should not be detrimental to the environment, should not probably have child or slave labor in its business model, should generally be a good corporate citizen, so to speak, right? So once you sort of get through that layer, it's actually really sitting down and understanding with the founder what their vision for the opportunity is. Now, in a lot of instances, particularly in, say, a software business, maybe it's actually really too early to figure out what the actual framework, as you were saying, Tim, should be to apply to that business from an ESG governance perspective, right? And it's not until they've actually built something that's of reasonable size where engaging with their customers, those signals come out of those relationships as to what they're physically actually having an impact on, right? And that could be all the way through to, in the social sense, a piece of software or capability helping people in their everyday work life to decrease stress. For mental health is a huge issue. We have another business called Sonda that their whole focus is on helping enable a better mental health status and environment for employees in corporate organizations and students in universities, as an example, right? They really are only getting to a point now where they could frame that in a way that they could use someone like Social Suite to actually measure the ongoing impact that may have, not only on them as a business, but on their staff and constituents, being their stakeholders as customers. So I think this journey is, with early stage businesses, one of, it's very hard to draw a line in the sand super early, but what you're trying to do is keep that ESG mindset in the business as it grows and refer back to that at board meetings, saying, right, how are we applying that? Does that become a guiding principle of the business? And as we move forward and we want to start to measure these things, is that something that would be part of that measurement protocol that we design and work with a company like Social Suite for?
Thanks. No, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, Boyd, from your perspective, Is it difficult these days to find ESG data on companies and metrics, and what in that ESG space? What type of ESG credentials, important for you to look at from an investment perspective and potential? And what do you see happening in the market around ESG data sets?
Okay, thank you. Gents, it's now pouring rain. I'm in the middle of a storm in a 1920s Queenslander, so you'll hear rain on the roof, so my apologies for that. So as I said before, we're looking at businesses which are relatively early in their life cycle. They're inherently environmentally friendly because we're investing in renewable and green energy. So that's, so we're already on top of that in sense of the type of businesses. So we're not investing in coal or gas or other types of energy. So we're already safely in that space. Now, getting information on these companies, and I think Grant's articulated it very well, it is quite difficult. They are very small companies. They're not focused in compliance or reporting with respect to ESG. They're in the ESG. I mean, that's the business they're in, but having them provide that type of reporting is just not their focus. Now, when we look at those businesses, we go through the due diligence, as Grant said, we do all the stuff that's there, we make sure that they're not doing anything dodgy, which generally that's not the case. We look carefully at management, and I think it's the credibility of the founders or management, how they deal, how they govern, what it is that they look at. People have invested in them. Are they looking after their money? So that's that really important sense of, are these people, do they have a sense of propriety, and are they the type of people that you want to work with and invest with? And ESG is a very important part of that. Now, as the business progresses through time, other things start to become important. So, for example, we have invested in a hydrogen business. We've acquired 100%. They will be developing some hydrogen projects. It's very important that when they develop, so the hydrogen itself meets the ESG purpose, but the development of that project has got a requirements way and above just that concept of clean, green hydrogen. So having a social license to operate, ensuring that you have all the social impact, you have all the environmental, you've covered all your Indigenous, local community issues, they're a very, very important part of that. So as we progress through those projects and we develop those, they're the type of things from an ESG perspective that we will report on. Now, I think reporting on the ASX is getting better and better, and the ability to comprehensively see companies identifying what the ESG issues are and how they are mitigating those is very important. And I think over time, compliance with that will start to be something that people just do, or it's going to be made to happen full stop. It's a bit hard on smaller companies, and I think that this urgency, we have to be careful that we don't layer over on smaller companies a sense of urgency to do things when perhaps what they're doing is not really impacting things greatly. So, if you've got Rio Tinto, for example, now how a company like that can do what it did at that gorge, having, it knows how to do these things. So that's somewhere where there should be focus, there should be that. But, if you've got a small company somewhere, say they're fabricating something, albeit in the green energy space, something for a wind turbine or something like that, how do you get them to comply and deal with that? So I think that urgency is there, but the cost of doing that versus, the benefits of it is something that perhaps we need to look carefully at. And Tim, I'm sure you've got another question I haven't answered yet. So.
But that's great. I think you touched upon a really salient point there around compliance, regulation, and right now we see that, particularly in Australia, but around the world, there's not a lot of compliance. Most of the ESG reporting that happens is voluntary reporting. So it's really a You choose your ESG framework, you report what you can. That's about it. There's not really much of an insurance process around that. Now, I think maybe a question for you first, Boyd, but also then potentially for Grant after is, from an investor point of view, would it help if a lot more regulation around that in terms of data, in terms of ensuring that everyone's doing that? Or are we where we are with the voluntary reporting? Is that getting to a point where that's working from an investor point of view?
Again, I'd restate the type of companies that we're investing in. Our due diligence will look at and identify if there are any ESG issues. As you move further forward, I think the form of compliance that's required, it's important. Our investors want to know that we're investing in good assets, and they're meeting this urgency for ESG, etc., like that. But I think it's a bit harsh to perhaps make compliance for smaller companies. It can be just very, very costly. Now, I haven't used Social Suite, so perhaps I need to step back and have a look at that, and maybe it's a very cost-effective way of identifying these. Now, I guess the other way to look at it is, and I think someone mentioned before, ESG brings opportunity too. It's not all about just, mitigating a risk because you're worried about it. It creates opportunity. So we're in that space of opportunity now. So, something where you're actually looking at this, you may be able to do some analysis. So even on, some of the old Harvard type Porter 5-force analysis type stuff, ESG is now becoming part of that as well. So look, it's an important thing. I think being able to get data, but doing it in a simple manner, not having it. I've got a lot of experience in workplace health and safety. I've got a lot of experience, and this is coming out of the UK, the Piper Alpha disaster, and that's created a whole raft of documentation and compliance around that. Now, that's not to say that environmental, health and safety, it's very, very important. It's fundamental. But sometimes I wonder whether we are going to create a compliance and data which is benefiting no one except the people who want us to do it. So we have to be careful about that. So I'll finish talking now, and off to you, Grant.
It's excellent, guys. I think some really good pointers here, and I think just from a big perspective as well, what we're looking at in terms of investment appetite across the ESG sector is obviously, taking a deeper look into the companies, because, Grant, Martin, Boyd, as you rightly pointed out, there can be quite a bit of greenwashing out there, especially as ESG becomes more and more topical. It's increasingly important to really sort of look behind the garb and see if the companies are actioning these ESG items beyond their ESG reports as well. And I think, from the panel discussion here, hopefully our viewers can take that away, that whether or not you're just getting into the ESG investment space or you're an avid ESG investor, it really is worth taking a deeper look and really fine-tuning that investment rationale a bit when evaluating the ESG credentials of the company. So that brings us to a conclusion of this webinar. Thank you to everyone who joined us today on behalf of Peak Asset Management and our partners, Social Suite. And a big thank you to our panelists for joining us as well. So thanks, everyone, and have a great day.